7th, sorry. War Game Wednesday, and they've been extraordinarily informative, and as I've discussed before, this is an effort to kind of get the war game community here in DC to know one another a little bit, and we do that by luring you in with a famous person, and in this case we have the designer Matt Calkins of Sekigahara and Charioteer fame, both of which are over here by GMT. And so Matt, unlike Volko and I, who you can't swing a cat without running into at a convention, we're very lucky to have Matt devote his time today to talk a little bit about his design process and how it is that someone could be both an expert on the unification of Japan and chariot driving at the same time. And so without too much further ado, Matt, if you want to kind of give us a little bit about your design process and the history behind what you've designed, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A.
That'd be great.
Terrific.
Thanks, Jason. And let me also say thank you to all of you and to Labyrinth for putting this on. Thank you. And I appreciate being here. Appreciate your interest. Now, I'll start out by just saying a little bit about what I'm trying to do. As a game designer, I've designed a few games. You might be familiar with Charioteer and Sekigahara, two of them. I also designed Magnet, which is a little-known abstract game, and Tin Goose, Rio Grande. And as you can see, they're all over the map. I've got an abstract, a business game, a war game, and a race. And my next one is a sports game, and who knows what after that. So I'm very inconsistent with regards to the theme. But I am consistent with regards to some things. And from this set of games, there's a pattern emerging about what kind of a game is the sort of game that I would write. And I do have some things that I'm going for that are starting to emerge, therefore, from the designs. I like the game to be as streamlined as possible. Some people use the word elegant to refer to a game, and generally what they mean by that is that it minimizes the time it takes to play it and the amount of rules you have to learn in order to play it in favor of maximizing something else, which is to say you get a lot of something relative to what you pay to play the game. You pay in time, you pay in rules, right? But you get something for that, and you get rather a lot of that. If it's elegant, you get rather a lot of that relative to the time and the energy that you put into the game. Well, I try to make elegant games. I try to make ones where you get a lot of something, and I have a particular thing that I'm trying to give you out of the games. I want it to be as lifelike as possible. I want it to feel like you're in that situation, right? I really tried that with Sekigahara. I'd be happy to talk about how I tried to make that feel like you are Tokugawa Ieyasu, right? And you are facing this situation, and it actually kind of feels like you're in that position. You don't know things he didn't know. You don't have powers he didn't have. You're really in that situation. You have his personal vulnerabilities. You have his knowledge. You have his capability. I really wanted to put you in those shoes. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do and maximize relative to the cost of playing a game. Another one is I want it to be deterministic, by which I mean I want good play to win. And finally, I want you to have a lot of choices, and I mean real choices, not just, hey, I'm at a choice point, but it's obvious what I have to do. I don't want the game to play you, I want you to play the game. So I want it to be realistic, lots of choices that actually mean something, that make you think, hey, I could pick either one of these and it would be an interesting choice. And then I want the better play to win most of the time. So that's what I'm going for in these games. I also focus a lot on mechanisms. To me, that's what I love most about designing games, is the logic. And so my games have novel mechanisms. I try to write something that you've never seen before. That's the point of it. I wouldn't want to take anybody else's mechanism. I'm trying to give you something in logic that you haven't seen. And I also put more strain on my mechanisms than other designers do. I ask the mechanism to do things. I ask it to carry the weight of the game in ways that typically games do not. Games these days will give you color in a lot of ways. Maybe the mechanism feels like you're actually Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600, or maybe it doesn't, but you have a deck of cards that have events that would have happened to him, and the card makes you feel like you're Tokugawa Ieyasu. Well, to me, option A always, option B never. Right? That's how I design. I remember when I was doing Tin Goose, my business game, and I met with Zev from Z-Man, who published my game Magnet. And he looked it over, he says, this isn't actually very good. That what you need is a card that you can play on someone that says, you're a bad manager, lose 2 income. And I said, Zev, that's just not how I do it, right? That's not the game I'm creating. I want to put all the weight on the mechanism and let the mechanism be the medium through which you tell the story. I don't want to layer anything over on top of the mechanism and have that tell the story. The mechanism's got to be so good that it feels like reality and it tells the story right there. So that's the challenge that I try to get into when I build one of these. Now, my latest here is Charioteer. I should say there's 2 ways you can make a game. And I think it's really interesting to consider the 2 different ways, and I've taken both. We talked about this just a few moments ago when we were having dinner. You can either take a situation from real life and try to distill it down to the causal relationships that created that situation. Or you can start with logic or math or a mechanism and build it up until it starts to feel like or resemble a theme. And nearly any game you can say went along one of those 2 paths. Any game that has any pretense to depicting a real life situation probably traversed one of those 2 paths to get where it is. And I've done both. Sekigahara was definitely top down. I just loved studying Japanese history. I wanted to do it some more. It gave me an excuse to do it. And I started with a complicated situation, asked myself what could happen and what are the means by which those things would have happened, and tried to depict a mechanism or a set of mechanisms that could have gotten you that feel. On the other hand, Magnet, abstract, purely bottom up. It never left the logic zone. And Tin Goose is top down. I started with the golden age of commercial aviation. How can I create a game that feels like that with the real risks that you don't generally feel in business games? Business games are always just upward, and there's never a real sense of fear and the possibility of disaster. And so I wanted to design a business game that could do that. It turned out to be very challenging, but that's what Tin Goose was. And then Charioteer is actually a bottom-up game. Charioteer is a mechanism, and it simulates racing in an interesting way, but it's actually a bottom-up game. It is very simple. You move your chariot forward by melding sets out of your hand. The sets are matching symbols. The symbols come in 4 colors. Those colors represent types of move with special powers. One of them is fast, one of them is an attack, one is a recovery, one is turning a corner. So every time you make a move, you're making a kind of a move. And you're getting better at that kind of a move. There's a strategy element in that you can forego the most effective move right now in order to build your skill in a category that you expect to be good at by the end of the game and gain some advantage by having specialized in it. And that's really the strategic tension in the game. There's a move that might be better at this moment that'll give you more spaces on the track, but if you're investing for the future, you may not want to make that move. You'd rather kind of trade off whether you care more about the end result of being good at turning corners by the 3rd lap, or whether you're just going to just do the expedient thing and play those cards. So that's what I was trying to do, real decisions. I wanted to be able to play in an hour. I wanted there to be about 20 real decisions per player, so you should be playing a move every 3 minutes. So it has to be simultaneous, it has to be fast, you're matching symbols, you're making a decision, you just go. And it's supposed to really move along. I wanted a race game that was fast. I don't think they're very fun if they're not fast. And I was trying to create nothing but a raw mechanism here. In fact, originally it was promotable dice instead of cards, and that turned out to be too slow. Originally the decision was between promoting a dice and promoting a die and using it for what you just rolled it as. And I love the idea of promotable dice. In fact, I'm doing it in my next game, which is coming out, who knows, from GMT. But it'll be promotable dice straight up, right? It'll be simulating tennis and squash. And it's like Liar's Dice with promotable dice. Whereas this one, it couldn't do promotable dice. That was too heavy. I had to switch to cards to make it move faster. But it was a raw mechanism early on. I mean, I've been thinking about promotable dice because I thought it would make a good RPG. This was truly a bottom-up, a logic-first design. And when I picked the kind of race that it is, first of all, nothing is simpler than a race. Every game's a race. If you play Tikal and you're moving your scoring token around the edge, that's a race game, right? There happens to be an exploration game in the middle of the board, but it's still a race game around the edge of the board. There's absolutely nothing simpler than a race game. It's just a number, right? And so I tried to create the absolute simplest framework, in like a frame in which to display the mechanism. And the mechanism is actually meant for bigger things, and someday it might become something bigger. But I love the exploration of this new logical little bit of horology, and so that's what this is about. It's about this little logical kernel that can be made into a very interesting and straightforward racing game, and in the future it could be made into something far more ambitious, like maybe an RPG with promotable dice. Who knows? But I love it for the mechanism. In fact, that's really my favorite thing in nearly any game, whether it's a top-down game or a bottom-up game. I love the mechanisms. So I don't want to just ramble. I'd love to talk about whatever is of interest to you. So how about I stop the monologue and take questions or topics, and either game, any game I've done, I'm happy to talk about. Just
fantastic.
Whatever's on your mind.
Thank you. Matt, you're an economist by training.
Yeah.
Does game theory inform your designs, and did it inform what you were doing with Sekigahara?
Okay. Game theory is a great branch of economics because it dispels one of the most common fallacies in economic research, which is that information is total and complete. That is not only the great fallacy of economics, it is the great fallacy of wargaming. And so there is a natural connection between game theory, which I did study, and board gaming, and yet I don't feel like I've used it very specifically. You could use it to describe the game, but I wouldn't say it went into the game, other than just to say the things that are fallacies bug me. The things that, the way that the commonly used basket of mechanisms that people deploy repeatedly to describe conflict simulations, they don't always cover all the situations. There's some situations they cover, in fact, very poorly. And some of the notable flaws are perfect information, time delay of decisions, lack of knowledge about the capabilities of even your own agents. I mean, there's a set of things. But all of that, I find it interesting to create mechanisms that account better for some of these verities than typical mechanisms do. And so while I'm not really using game theory, I'm going in the same direction that game theory was going.
Interesting. Just a quick follow-up on that train of thought then, before we open it up to everybody else. Would you say then Sekigahara is a critique of wargaming?
Well, it abandons wargaming. It looks at all those tropes and just says no thanks. I wanted it to be that way. I hope it doesn't remind you of anything. It was supposed to not remind you of anything. It's supposed to just be a different world. I remember shopping this I talked to Jay at Rio Grande, and he said he wouldn't publish it because no one would ever buy a game with that name. He said, you're gonna have to call it Shogun or I won't publish it, right? I wanted it to feel different. I wanted it to feel really outside of the realm. So I wanted to invent. It's not supposed to be a repudiation. It's just supposed to be a new expedition with more or less indifference to whatever has been done in the past.
Excellent. Kevin? Actually, introduce yourselves when you ask a question.
I'm Kevin Bertram. I own Foot Circle Games, a local game publishing company. So, Matt, I hear you talking a lot about you want to build a system, and so everything is kind of built on that systemic level for development. Are you ever concerned that when you're working with a historical game, you're giving too much agency to players that really wasn't available, whether because of cultural bias or logistical or what, invent any other, whatever reasons might that be? Are you worried that like a math-based systemic system is a little too perfect and misses some of the nuance of history?
Yeah, I guess there are a few fallacies in game design that I might just be okay with. And one of them is that victory is possible. Another is that agency exists. And I think that if you were to really examine the philosophy that I said I had about designing games, about being realistic and put you in someone's shoes, you might actually have that refutation, you could say, well, actually, they had no choice. They basically had to do what they were going to do, and their cultural biases predetermined it. And it's like, yeah, you could be right. You could be right, and yet it wouldn't make as good a game. So I'm going to assume agency, right? Even if historically it didn't really exist, and I'll still seek the polarized outcome, which I think is a hallmark of a game. So yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're right.
But we struggle with that, so that's why I was curious to.
Yeah.
Sir.
My name's Burke. I just play games. But can you explain what you mean by promotable dice? It sounds interesting.
Oh yeah. You would. I'm describing now my upcoming game on tennis and squash. All right, so you get your player, and your player has skills at the primary abilities that make you good at tennis or squash. Things like, do you have good touch, right, on the racket? Do you have good stamina? And are you good at being in the right position, right? So each one of those you have a certain amount of skill at, and if you're bad, you get a 4-sided die in that color. If you're okay, you get a 6-sided. If you're good, you get an 8-sided. As the game goes on, you will have opportunities to promote one of those dice up 2 more sides. You can turn your 8-sided into a 10-sided, and the 10 later to a 12. There aren't too many opportunities, and they come with a sacrifice. And so you have to decide whether you're willing to make that sacrifice, which is essentially to forego that skill for the rest of that game, in order to have it be a stronger skill starting in the next game or the next set if you're playing tennis. So that's what I mean by promotable dice. The die becomes better. You make a temporary sacrifice. And the later dice, by the way, they're not normal dice. They're not just 1 through 6.
Sure.
They have icons on them. Like one icon might cause you a fatigue element. One might be a kill shot that gives you an advantage. So depending on which category you're moving up in, it'll actually be a very different sort of experience. If you move up in touch, you're going to get a lot of kill shots. If you move up in stamina, you're just going to get a consistent. No, sorry, stamina is very high variance. Position just gives you a consistent bonus as you move up the scale.
I've got a question. You said, David Hobbs, game player too. You said that Sekigahara should feel very different, and you wanted it that way. So I don't know much about the game. So what are the mechanisms that make it feel different?
Oh, sure. Okay, first of all, no dice. And not perfect information. Your units are hidden, other players' units are hidden, so you don't know what each other's got. And when you get into battle, you have a hand of cards. The number of cards in your hand represents your personal legitimacy. Ishida Mitsunari and Tokugawa Ieyasu are rival warlords, but their legitimacy builds and fluctuates as the game goes on, and that's how many cards they have in their hand. In battle, your units don't automatically fight for you. You have to have a matching card that indicates their clan, and if you don't have it, they will not fight. And you also may have a loyalty challenge card, in which case when your opponent deploys a unit toward you, you can challenge it, and unless they can show that they have in fact another card that matches that, the card defects, the block defects and fights for you. Which is realistic. This actually happened in the Battle of Sekigahara. There were some turncoats, and the battle pivoted on that, and on the unwillingness of certain units, like the Mori units, to engage in battle. So it's realistic, but it's unique as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Chris. I can hold my breath for 10 minutes. When you talk about, that's a line from a video game, don't put me underwater. When you talk about using game theory and economics as a framework for talking about games, it can be tempting to use it not just as a framework, but as an actual tool. Like I work with statistics a lot, and when I play games, it's very easy to think in terms of very basic sums and averages and variances and means and stuff like that. And as you're designing or thinking about mechanics, especially very simple ones, it's easy to see that this one is strictly better than this one or something like that.
Yeah.
And the temptation is to add enough variance or enough interdependence to the point that a human can't possibly optimize it. But the more that you add these interdependence, the central limit theorem tells you that there will be more and more strategies that are by value equivalent. And so it actually removes the meaningfulness of your choices even as you try to increase it. If you have this framework in mind where you can't keep yourself from thinking about stuff like that, how do you defeat that as a gamer, as a game designer?
Yeah. Well, I do feel like it gives me a little bit of a helpful boost as a designer that I also play the games competitively. I don't play many cons, but I do get to the WBC every year. and it helps to think as a player. I find that my games end up being so balanced so as to confound me personally. Like just what you were saying, except that's for me, right? I create my game so I don't know what to do. Because it seems like every strategy that I would have wanted to play, I've nerfed it just enough so it's not so good anymore, and everything I thought wasn't good has been made a little bit better, and now maybe I'll have to consider it, and it leaves me in a state of indifference, more or less, about where to go. But that the fact that I approach the game as a player sometimes helps me design it so that it doesn't have a dominant strategy. I don't think it has an absence either, because your circumstances will be depicted by some random things. I don't have any games without variance. So it may be cards, it might be random placement at the beginning, it might be drawing random blocks that change your initial setup. I don't have any that would devolve into standard openings with predictable knowledge of both sides' position. If I did, that would make the challenge much more difficult. Then you'd really have to analyze it. But no, I just analyze to confuse myself. I just design to the point where I don't know what to do anymore.
Volker?
I'm Volker Runker. So the value system that you laid out in terms of your design, I wonder now what games you like to play that are not your designs, and how do they either conform with that value system, or do you seek departure from that and something that you wouldn't design but you enjoy playing? What are the games, especially within conflict simulation, historical games?
Yeah.
What are some examples, and how do they conform or depart from your values as a designer?
Okay. I should first confess that I almost never play any conflict simulations, which is crazy because I love them. But I just don't have a game group that wants to, and I don't meet that many often, and I don't go to very many cons, and so I just haven't much of a chance, actually.
And online play doesn't draw you?
I never, no.
Well, we'll all come over.
That's the answer. That's the answer. I think you'll come over. That wouldn't be such a bad idea.
Look, a whole new gaming group right here.
That's right. That's right. So I haven't played too many, and my examples are going to feel a little bit out of date. I played the old Columbia block games. I loved Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage, and the Russian campaign. I saw it on the shelf here somewhere.
Yeah, there it is.
There's a winner. And I haven't played enough of the recent ones, and I just need to reprioritize my priorities, I think.
Those are all formative for me too.
Yeah.
Every single thing you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's right.
What other games do you like not in conflict simulation?
When I can get my group together, we're likely to play a mid-weight Euro, often a business game. It could be Power Grid or Automobile. Those are favorites. I wish I designed those. Sometimes it's I like Reiner Knizia a lot. They're easy to learn, and since I don't often get a chance to play games multiple times, I want something I have a fair shot at playing the first time. And so Knizia is good about giving you a fair shot, I feel like, the first time through. I like Elegant Games, and he's good for that. Yeah.
And a mathematician.
Yes. If you've ever read his book on Dice Games Properly Explained, it shows that he really brings a mathematical mind to game design.
What's that name again?
Dice Games Properly Explained, which actually grew out of his thesis. He became a banker, but he was obviously interested in games from the beginning. But it's a masterful book on games. He doesn't just explain dice games, he improves all sorts of them. It's a research project, and then he rewrites the game to make it better.
Do you think it's important to design on things that you know about?
If you do it top down, yes. If you do it bottom up, then you're not really trying to simulate that thing, and in that case, no, it doesn't matter. But top down, you don't have to know about it before you start. You just have to know about it before you finish. Right? I wanted an excuse to study Japanese history when I did Sekigahara, and it gave me that.
So based on that, would you say that you tend to be kind of theme first and you fit mechanics to that, but then listening to your kind of design methodology, it sounds like you focus a bit on mechanics and then find a theme that fits those mechanics?
My favorite approach is to start with a theme and get to a mechanic the way an oyster would get to a pearl. Start with the imperfection, the asymmetry, the illogic, the in-world weirdness of a situation, and then let that force you into mechanism design territory that nobody's ever had to go to. So that's the way I prefer to do it.
Hi, my name is Troy. I have a question. When you talk about essentially the design economy of your game, when do you and how do you determine when the investment is too great for what you're getting out?
The investment
On behalf of the player, like learning rules and.
Oh, okay. Rule overhead is like a budget. You start out, like I consciously designed Charioteer saying my budget's an hour. I want a group of roughly 4 people to be able to play this in 1 hour and make 20 decisions each and have them be actual decisions. And so that was my budget. And you can only fit the overhead in that fits within that budget. And with Sekigahara, my budget was bigger. I was willing to have the game go for 2 to 3 hours. And if you play to the end, it does. But it's still relatively simple. It's still a pretty approachable game. The complexity is more in the hidden information and the cards and not randomness. There aren't any dice in Sekigahara. And so I think it has to do with your budget. I think different design attempts can, maybe one of them would have led me away from where I wanted to go. They didn't in this case, but I could imagine having discovered a mechanism in, say, Charioteer. I thought, this is so good, I love it, but it doesn't fit in an hour. I'm just going to be willing to abridge my initial budget and create the game that it wants to be instead of the game that I wanted it to be. That could happen. I think it's less about the mandate of the budget and more about the ratio. As I was saying, I think that elegance is a ratio. The denominator there is your time and your complexity, but the numerator is whatever you want to get out of it. In my case, I want determinism, speed of play, ease of use, feeling like you're really there. So realism, whatever it is you're aiming for, it's the ratio more than the budget, maybe even. It's the ratio that truly limits you. And so I guess with any game, if you thought of one more great idea that made the game much better and didn't add much overhead, you'd have to say, it belongs there, right? I got to put it in. So I think you should be willing to break your rule for that.
So one of the things that you'll hear from other creators, like filmmakers have a thing that they'll say that's like, you got to be ready to cut your favorite scene, even if it's the scene that made you start making the movie. Have you had a game idea or a mechanic that you had to cut even though it was your favorite?
Oh, constantly. The way I design games is the whole design hits me like a thunderbolt and I realize I'm almost finished. And then I make the game in a burst of enthusiasm. I make the cards, I draw the board, I test it, and I realize it's nowhere near finished. It's not even good, right? That idea was completely flawed, and I need to step back from it and gain enough of a distance before I can reapproach it and ask myself honestly, what was actually good about that? What part of that initial thing that I thought was good and finished was actually worth keeping? And frequently, big things that I thought were essential are not good. Like with Charioteer, I had to give up on promotable dice. That was the thing about the design, right? That was the core of it, that's the point of it, and I had to get rid of it because there was no way to make that fast enough. There was too much decisioning around the dice. Do I promote, do I not, on every move? I couldn't keep up with it. So yeah, the core of the design had to go. A great question to keep asking yourself as a designer. It's like climbing a hill that rounds out, right? You keep thinking you're close because you can see it, and then you climb up there. It's like, no, not close, right? It's actually way over there because you're climbing up the edge of a circle, sort of. The question to keep asking yourself is, what do I love about this design? And if you don't love it, it's not good enough. You shouldn't keep it, or you shouldn't keep it the way it is. And if you keep asking that, eventually you end up with something good. But it's easy to have mechanisms that you thought were good, for me anyway, and then realize you don't love them. Yeah, and so I absolutely relate to those directors who have to cut their favorite scene, definitely.
You're like that Japanese woman with throwing things away.
The Marie Kondo.
Yes, the Marie Kondo.
Yes.
Do I love this mechanism or not?
No, seriously. Especially if you want the game to be simple and elegant. You have to get very good at throwing things out. Steve Jobs is great about that with technology. He said that technology is more about what you remove than what you put in. I think that's a great thing to keep in mind for game design as well.
Agreed. Any other questions before we break into the teach session? Sir.
One other thing is, are there any themes that you are really interested in but haven't found a way to mechanically build?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. I'd love to do more economic stuff. I'd love to simulate conflicts that are neither economic nor military. I think that'd be a great way to explore games. There are other conflicts, and games don't explore them very much. I've been wanting to write a role-playing game for 40 years, what I would want to bring to a role-playing game would be very difficult to bring to it. I would want extreme consolidation of complexity down into the mechanism. And I've tried, I've got models, I've done elaborate things, flowcharts of dice and stuff. I mean, I'm trying to depict everything about fatigue and advantage and posture and space and, surprise and just everything with a mechanism, with an exceptionally rich playmat of pieces that you can understand at an instant and manipulate to kind of do so much more than rolling a d20 would have done. So I guess I'd have to say a role-playing game, and yet I'm no closer than I was 40 years ago to having a model that would work. And furthermore, I can't really do it because the content side doesn't interest me. And to build a game like that, you have to be a Gygaxian fountain of content and imagination, and I'm just not going to be that. So I could make the mechanism, and somebody else could make the content.
Well, this has been an extraordinarily interesting conversation, and thank you so much for all of that insight and giving us the time to share.
No, this is my pleasure.